Good afternoon. I'm Warren Hoge, IPI Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this speaker series event featuring Dr. Ahmed Shaheed, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. To start, a housekeeping note. We ask that you silence the ring on your cell phone, but we don't need you to cut it off, since we want people to feel free to tweet this event, which is also being webcast. For the Twitterati, and I see a few of you in the audience, know that we use the hashtag IPINST to track our tweets. Dr. Shaheed, named to his current post by the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, is in New York to formally deliver to the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly later this week one of the two reports he does each year. The other report, which goes directly to the Human Rights Council, is produced in March. This new report has been circulating among ranking UN and Iranian officials and others with a need to know, and it will become available to the public on Wednesday. We are privileged to have Dr. Shaheed here today to discuss it prior to its public release. The report itself is 23 pages long and is accompanied by a 66-page response submitted by Iran. The rapporteur position is an elected one, and Dr. Shaheed, who has served since June of 2011, can qualify for a third year in the post if he is approved by the Human Rights Council in a scheduled mandate review this March. That mandate can be extended with annual reviews for a maximum of 6 years. Rapporteurs, as you know, are regarded as independent experts and are not considered UN officials. In doing his research, Dr. Shaheed has not been able to gain entry to Iran itself. He has filed requests which specify that he must have free access and not be accompanied by government minders. And while these requests have not been formally denied, they have also not been accepted. And as a consequence, Dr. Shaheed has conducted his research and prepared this report through interviews with hundreds of alleged human rights abuse victims outside of Iran, usually in places with large Iranian diaspora communities. His office says that his interviews are aimed at cross-checking and verifying received information in accordance with, quote, journalistic standards. You have Dr. Shaheed's biography in your papers, but briefly, he is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Maldives, a position he held twice. He obtained his BA in International Politics and Strategic Studies from the University of Wales at Aberystwyth and his PhD in the field of international relations from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. So, Dr. Shaheed, welcome to IPI. We are eager to hear the findings of your inquiry into the human rights situation in Iran. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Warren. Ladies and gentlemen, first
Speak directly in that. Good.
I wish to thank the staff of the International Peace Institute, especially Mr. Hoge, Warren, for arranging this discussion. And thank you all for your presence here today. I shall be rather brief in my opening statement, wishing to engage with you subsequently in an interactive manner. The promotion and protection of universal human rights principles is one of the greatest challenges facing the international community today. A lack of respect for these rights and the absence of institutions and processes to prevent and remedy violations retards development and sows the seeds for much of the conflict, unrest, and injustice that we see in the world today. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights gave flesh and bones to the UN Charter's determination to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. This focus on the individual has much broader implications for the stability and well-being of the international community as a whole. For it is only through a universal respect for the human person without distinction as to race, religion, or any other differentiating factor that the international community can achieve the peaceful relations necessary to promote the economic and social advancement of all peoples. Iran, however, seems to be abandoning this compact in response to the current political climate. This comes at a time when it could use the system to lessen the potential for politicization, an issue the Iranian government has often expressed as causing it deep concern. No country is immune from criticism for its human rights record, and Iran is clearly no exception. However, in the absence of meaningful interaction with the UN special procedures and treaty bodies and other members of the international community, the absence of such engagement seems to fuel the focus on Iran's human rights record. Despite statements by various Iranian functionaries regarding Iran's interest in cooperation, and despite Iran's standing invitation to thematic special procedures since 2002, a number of urgent appeals made by various thematic special rapporteurs remain unaddressed. A number of requests to visit also remain unresponded. It is further troubling that no country visits have taken place since 2005, deepening the void of information and lack of access, which creates space for international community to imagine the worst. It is evident that, by and large, the country, Iran, possesses the basic legal framework and tools to promote respect for human rights. The country is a party to 5 of the 9 legally binding international human rights treaties, and many of the rights guaranteed in these treaties are enshrined in its constitution. Yet, Iran is still considered to be a substantial human rights violator, meriting special attention from the international community. Some 240 interviews have been conducted with individuals that reported the violation of their human rights or the rights of others since I began my work mid-last year. The reports and testimonies relayed to me during these interviews demonstrate that the international community's concern is fully warranted. The allegations contained in these reports paint a disturbing picture of a government that seriously struggles to comply with its international and national obligations. These reports demonstrate that the rule of law that governs Iran's institutions and processes is frequently breached. Impunity is promoted by a reluctance to hold violators accountable, and the protection of the space for public scrutiny or advocacy of policies and actions that have an impact on the integrity of governance has been severely eroded. This seems to affect a majority of Iran's public institutions and manifests itself in those processes that influence the ability to govern with accountability and consent. Therefore, international commitments and constitutional provisions notwithstanding, elements of Iran's legal framework, together with insufficient adherence to the rule of law, create systemic obstacles to the government's ability to adhere to its human rights obligations. Several Iranian government representatives have expressed that the allegations in my reports are, to quote them, baseless or out of date, and that the contents of my report are merely a copy and paste of the reports by the Secretary General. I would like to note that if Iranian authorities see similarities in the two reports, it is probably because the allegations reported impart a clear pattern of human rights violations in the country to both authors. While sustainable solutions to Iran's human rights challenges must come from people of Iran themselves, there is much room for support from the international community. I firmly believe that the establishment of this mandate provides for a more coordinated engagement with the Iranian authorities on a range of human rights issues that have been raised by the international community. The mandate is an opportunity to facilitate a deeper, country-specific understanding of the human rights situation in Iran in its unique cultural and historical contexts, in order to advance the current efforts being made to address Iran's challenges in an incremental and holistic manner. Lastly, I believe that it is important that this mandate not be viewed as punitive. Cooperation presents opportunities to allay international concerns by increasing transparency and dialogue aimed at strengthening those mechanisms that promote and protect human rights in Iran. It is an opportunity for the Iranian government to address allegations of human rights violations in an impartial and non-politicized forum. However, this requires constructive engagement through both communication and field visits to Iran. It is my hope that Iran will eventually view this mandate as a secure and legitimate space in which to take steps to comply with its obligations under international law and to address the areas of concern communicated to the country during its interactions with the international community on human rights issues. Therefore, I will continue to seek cooperation of Iran and continue to seek the help of all member states in the UN and other stakeholders in furthering the work of the mandate. As you have heard, I have so far produced 3 reports on the Iranian situation, and some of them accompanied with long, if you like, a list of cases I have interviewed. And on the current occasion, I also attached to it in my website, which should become operational this Wednesday, the comments that Iran had passed on to me. As you heard, my report is about 23 pages. The commentary was about 66 pages. I was quite pleased to have received the commentary, but on inspection, it is about just 3 or 4 comments altogether. One is that the mandate is illegitimate and a politicized outcome of the Council's political biases. The second is that my code of conduct, that is the code of conduct required of all special rapporteurs, requires me to respect the laws of the country while on mission, and therefore I should not criticize the laws of a country of which I am the mandate holder. I think it's a misreading of the code of conduct. And thirdly, these notes affirm that Iran does have the laws that proscribe the kinds of practices that I allege it to be carrying out. For example, it has laws against torture, it has laws to ensure fair trials, and so on and so forth. And therefore, that's it. I do quite, in my opinion, faithfully represent the comments that were contained in this report, which should be up for public release this Wednesday. There are in very broad terms, 2 issues I raise in my reports. One is to do with rule of law deficits, whether it's questions of fair trials, questions of vague charges, or draconian sentences. Rule of law issues are one of the major areas of concern that I have with Iran. The other I can broadly categorize as discrimination, whether based on gender, religion, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. So in very broad terms, these are the types of issues you will find in my reports. I shall not go on any further, but would like to talk with you on an interactive basis on any of the issues that concern you with Iran. And lastly, I do refer in my report to increasing concerns about the impact of sanctions on Iran. The methodology I have used in my reports so far, because I have not been able to go to Iran, is what is called testimony-based witness statements. So if I find a credible witness who claims to be a victim of torture, I document that. I do not think this methodology is sufficient to really get a full understanding of the impact of sanctions. I am seeking a visit to Iran, which should enable me to have a better methodology to investigate impact of sanctions. So for the future, I shall keep this as one of the priorities of the mandate. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask you some specifics, and let me do this by way of asking if conditions you found in past reports you have done continue. I mean, that's a way of trying to find out what's in this new report without actually saying what it is. And let me just list a couple of them. For instance, practices such as torture, cruel or degrading treatment of detainees, and the imposition of the death penalty without proper safeguards. Can you say whether that situation continues now?
Regrettably, yes. I am concerned that I have not noticed any significant improvement in the human rights situation in Iran. If anything, things have become worse. Reports of torture continue. And they do so also with, as if to say, impunity is part of it. I find very rarely any investigation of allegations of torture, and where they have been done, they have not looked into the actual real perpetrators. The senior-most people who may be found culpable for this have not been either named or have no action taken against them. So there is torture still happening in prisons in Iran. My current report also details rather cruel treatment given out to even human rights defenders. On death penalty, there are a number of issues about death penalty, and none really has been addressed, except in a very minute way, I think, two areas. First of all, those two areas. On stoning, methods of execution is also something I have raised in my reports, whether it's public executions or those done in secret, that is to say, without notifying the next of kin or the lawyer, and stoning as well. Now, on stoning, the new penal code, which at some stage was thought to have been finalized, but now believed to have gone back to Parliament for reconsideration, omits stoning as an explicit method of execution or punishment, which should be welcomed. But I am concerned that that does not prevent a judge from issuing a verdict of stoning, because under the Constitution of Iran, where the law is silent, a judge has to refer to Sharia fatwas, which can bring back stoning through a fatwa loophole. The other is juvenile executions. There have been concerns raised throughout of youths being executed, of children being executed in Iran. A large number of the executions in Iran are for drug offenses, and a lot of them actually are young people, many of them youths. Under the new penal code, there is provision to not issue death sentences for juvenile offenders, and giving the judge the scope to assess whether or not the person was cognizant of the crime when this was done. Again, I'm not fully satisfied with this, because CRC, the Child Rights Convention, requires that there be no execution of minors. But the fact that now there is scope to reduce or for a judge to walk away from issuing a death sentence to a minor is to be welcomed. But the number of executions, I don't see it as reducing. Last year, I was able to document something like 600 plus cases. 670 was the figure I gave in my report this March. That was for the last year. The data I have for this year speaks far less than that, but I think it may be because the information on this has become less. I have not seen any, I have no reason to believe that the rate of capital punishment offenses, verdicts being passed in the courts may have reduced. So I think the information flow has become restricted, and therefore that may be the reason why the number of people being executed is less. This morning, I am shocked to hear that 10 people may have been executed. I say may because I'm still looking at verification of these reports, but I fear they may have been executed this morning. 10 people. And it is quite commonplace to have large numbers of people executed same day in Iran. So yes, the short answer is the concerns remain unabated. If any, they just increase over time.
Thank you. Harassment of religious and ethnic minorities and of human rights defenders, you mentioned in one case there was, and civil society and religious actors. Does that situation continue? From the
information I have been able to gather over the past year, there appears to have been a spike or intensification of persecution over the past couple of years. A lot of it, of course, dates back to the election violence of 2 years ago. But even otherwise, if you look at it in a 3-year period, that's the figures that come up. And with the Christian community, I am disturbed by reports of increasing persecution, both in terms of the numbers of people who are being harassed or arrested or in some ways punished for just practicing their faith, the kinds of difficulties or harassment that what are called house churches face in Iran. And to speak in very simple terms here, the picture is that the targeting of new converts is, I think, what's really at issue at the present time. Those who convert from, say, Islam to Christianity are targeted for persecution, and those who proselytize or evangelize are subject to persecution. But one bit of good news in this was the fate of Pastor Nadakani, Yusuf Nadakani, who had been sentenced for execution on apostasy charges. After intense lobbying by the international community, I think last month, I got news that he's been freed, that the death sentence will not be carried out, that he is a free person to go, and that the ruling was that the time he'd served was the time that was what the sentence actually wanted under a revised sentence on his case. So that's just one glimmer of hope, but the broad picture is the harassment continues. And same goes for other minority religions, which are even recognized in the constitution, like the Sunni minority. But the Baha'is, being an unrecognized religion, perhaps suffer the worst because their status is as an unrecognized religion. And the numbers of Baha'is who have been imprisoned have increased, over 100 at the present time from information I have. And they face a whole range of discrimination, from being unable to practice their faith, being denied access to basic services because of practice called Hoge screening, as for screening for ideological and religious, I suppose, loyalty to the state. And often they face charges unrelated to their faith. It could be national security charges, public order charges. And by and large, I would say the Baha'is are the most persecuted religious minority in Iran.
Can they be persecuted for simply assembling as a group?
Indeed, yes. Indeed, assembly of any sort is a perilous exercise, is at peril. And certainly if Baha'is or some of the even other religions, they have an assembly, they can be detained or charged for this. I have received reports of Baha'is being forced to disperse or action being taken against them from assemblies even for devotional purposes. I've got reports of the Dervish community also reporting that they have also been targeted for assembly, dispersed and arrested for assembly. So assemblies space for public assembly is very limited, whether it's political purposes or devotional purposes.
In cases like the cases you're talking about, when people are detained or imprisoned, are they charged? You made the point, and I'm going to go back to it a little bit later on earlier, that actually there are laws that exist in Iran. They're simply not being enforced, or they're being ignored. In some of these cases you've been mentioning, when Sunnis or Baha'is or Dervishes or Christians are arrested or detained, are they actually charged, or is it just detention without any explanation?
By and large, they are charged, and often within the limitation that's in law. I have not found many cases of people complaining that the charge had not come at the time as said in the law. But it can be very vague charges. It can be charges unrelated to the activity that they may have been carrying out. It may also be a charge that would remove a lot of the defenses safeguards given to them under the Constitution. For example, if you're a journalist, you're entitled to have a public trial for offenses linked to the media. But if you're charged for a national security offense, then you get tried in the revolutionary courts. in which you don't get your public trial, and the reports from these courts are typically of what are called summary trials. A trial may last no longer than a few minutes. In almost every case I have come across, people complain that they didn't have sufficient chance to defend themselves because the case files were not given to them in time, or they may not get a chance to cross-examine or even know who the witness against them are. So basic fair trial standards don't obtain in the revolutionary courts. But even if they are charged, I have received several complaints. It appears to be the practice that they may languish in prison, often in solitary confinement, or without contact with the family and so on, from weeks to months before their cases are processed.
Do they get access to legal counsel?
Not during the investigation stage, typically, but in many cases, just before the trial, the lawyer might get bundles of files just a couple of days, perhaps before trial.
One other thing I want to ask you about is the charge of denial of medical treatment. What does that mean, and how does that work?
Prison conditions in some prisons, especially, is quite poor, and you have the UN minimum standard minimum rules for detainees from 1957, which specifies the kinds of medical treatment that should be available in place of detention or to detainees. But there are reports in some prisons that they just get no access whatsoever to medical treatment, or in some cases, when detainees are quite ill, they may not be given the required medical treatment. It varies, but in some prisons, the reports are that detainees have no access to required medical attention.
Are deaths in Iranian prisons commonplace?
Deaths in custody do occur, and this has occurred at a rate that has raised the concern of the Human Rights Committee. For example, when they reviewed Iran last year, they took issue with Iran on that subject because there are many reports of custodial deaths resulting sometimes from torture.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the release of a prisoner. Are there prisoners released frequently? Are they a lot of prisoners who are just out of touch?
There are occasions in which Iran grants amnesty or pardon to large numbers of people. I think last month, 100 or so were pardoned, and last year too. It may occur around Ramadan period or around the other Eid festival or some other event in Iran. I have not been able to obtain the criteria applied in granting these pardons, whether these are given to certain types of detainees or certain types of offenders, or whether they result from deals being made or whatnot. So I have not really been able to identify the terms under which pardons are granted, but yes, annually pardons are granted.
Now, Ahmed, you kindly call me by first name. I'll call you by your first name. Ahmed, the 66-page Iranian response you have said actually comes down to three kind of specific claims. But I wanted to ask you, does that response specifically address any of the charges you make, saying they are untrue or saying that you've got the story wrong, actually that person was released or pardoned or whatever? Or are they just a general attack on your mandate, the viability of your office, and your right to say what you say?
I have not been told that any of the facts I report have been inaccurate. So on none of the cases I have documented has Iran come back and told me that the facts actually are different. There was considerable disagreement between Iran and others on what the charges were against Pastor Nadakani, by and large because there were many who believed that the charges were being revised against him. But I have not been proven to be factually wrong in any of the matters I have raised. Two other, of course, points in the commentary were one that my information sources were biased in the sense that Iran regards many people I speak to as enemies of the state or terrorists, as they have said in the response. But the people I speak to are a wide range of people. There are people inside Iran. About a quarter of people have interviewed via Skype, or people within Iran. The rest obviously have left the country either recently or for many years in the past. But many of them actually are Iranian NGOs, human rights NGOs working outside the country. I've also received delegations from Iran who are government sympathetic from what they've been telling me. I've also met delegations of the Mujahideen Khalq, the MKO. I presume that's the people they would have been referring to. I've also met with a number of other ethnic NGOs. So I wasn't quite sure who they mean by that. But my yardstick is, if the report presented to me is a report of violation, if it can be corroborated, if it's credible, if it can just be authentic, it goes into my report.
Well, you've anticipated I was going to ask you questions about the reliability of your reporting, and let me just ask you a few more things on that same point. You've addressed some of them already. Do you feel secure about your information? When I was talking with your associate, David Siegel, beforehand, he told me that the interviews were meant to sort of cross-check and verify. Do you feel pretty secure? And you say you've not been challenged factually. How secure, and this is a journalist asking, how secure do you feel that you're right about what you're saying?
Well, I do not use all the information that's passed on to me. I think quite a lot are left out simply because I haven't been able to screen them, assess them for veracity. I have not used any material that cannot be verified from multiple sources. Yeah. I do insist upon getting multiple corroboration of incidents. Of course, the burden of proof I'm required to use is not the same as in a court of law. Mm-hmm. If the incident can be corroborated by more than one person and independently done so, and if the material is consistent with other reports on the same situation, I believe that I am entitled to use that as an allegation of concern. And I have not used every allegation that's been passed on to me. Sure. I have verified them before I used them.
When you mentioned that you have interviewed Iranians within Iran, how have you done that?
I beg your pardon?
When you said you've interviewed people within Iran, you have not been allowed to go yourself. How have you managed to interview people inside Iran?
Well, by and large, as 99% of the time, I speak to them, or my team of associates speak to them via Skype. And there are certain precautionary mechanisms to be used in doing that to ensure that people who talk to me do not get, if you like, caught out for speaking to me. And there's a protocol to be used in doing that. There have been brave souls who called me from prison as well, using telephone. So it's been a variety of ways of doing that. And I would, at this point, like to say that even if I were to visit Iran, for example, I may not have been able to access some of these people to the level I'm doing now. Because, of course, if you looked at what's happened to previous rapporteurs, there were 2 visits in the past, and I met my predecessor. The government of Iran can, if they wish, keep track of who is meeting the rapporteur, and many can be deterred in coming forward if that were the case.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you, and you've partially answered it. Are there cases where people reach out to you? Do people in Iran, by this I mean potential abusees, know of your existence, and do some of them reach out to try to contact you?
Yes. Excuse me. I think the office of the mandate holder, or the fact that there's a mandate holder, is widely known in Iran. I should say that the Iranian diaspora, and it's a number that keeps on rising all the time. They're very well connected, very well organized, and very well networked. So they are able to pass down information about my office and how to contact me quite well. And I believe the government's responses to me also, which have come quite high profile, also add, as it were, to my profile in the country. For example, just last week I was reading in the press that the head of judiciary had called my report an affront to Islam. Now, that kind of comment from such a functionary would be read very widely, and certainly is intended to be read very widely within Iran. And so the government's response to my mandate itself disseminates information about my existence, and therefore ways for them to reach out to me.
They sort of acknowledge your existence by complaining about you.
Absolutely.
I think that's, I've got some other questions, but I'd like to get some comments from the floor, questions from the floor. Yes, in the back. Lou, if you would wait for the microphone, and please identify yourself for the webcasting. Thank you.
Thanks. Lou Charbonneau, Reuters News Agency. I wondered if you could expand on what you said about concerns that the sanctions against Iran are having an impact on people, and how this fits in with your mandate. Thanks.
Should I respond?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, what I said was there are increasing concerns raised often by the media, but now also coming from Iran, that there are shortages that can have an impact on the ability of people to realize their basic human rights. For example, in medicines and so on. There was a report, I think, had by AFP yesterday, referring to an Iranian functionary of Medical Association complaining that certain types of medicines are in short supply. So that's one sort of concern. Of course, you also have reports of the devaluation of the rial and the economic discontent that's happening. So one has to be careful that sanctions can, general sanctions can have an impact on the ability of a country to realize the human rights. But what I'm saying is I am not able to speak on this subject authoritatively without investigating further, because the methodology I'm using so far is to look at testimonies of individuals. That doesn't provide a sound basis to determine causation of various, if you like, sanctions-linked outcomes. So I would need to be able to have a better picture of a situation beforehand, the kinds of responses Iran itself has had to, or has been able to do in response to the sanctions, what kind of adjustments they have made with regard to their internal allocations, and extent to which the humanitarian exemptions themselves are working or not working. So these are all issues I must study in more detail before I can say with confidence that certain outcomes are linked directly to sanctions and certain types of sanctions.
But if I can just keep going with Lou's question, but you do hear in some of the comments evidence that the sanctions are having effect. For instance, the rial, which has lost 40% of its value. Have you heard any comments from people, not specifically mentioning that, but reflecting that situation and complaining about their condition right now?
Well, yes, a number of the Iranian diaspora community also have expressed concern to me that the financial sanctions really are biting, and that there is an impact. They are concerned about the developing impact of sanctions on the country. But again, they are also basing their information on, if you like, general indicators. You know, economic devaluation causes economic hardship, causes pain, and therefore, you know, it can have an impact on the rights of people to right to life, right to economic and social rights. But one again has to look at how far are those outcomes the result of directly of sanctions themselves, or the inability of the government to perhaps adjust their own, if you like, expenditure to or to prioritize on social security expenditures. Now, sanctions include UN Security Council sanctions, past sanctions as well. And the objective of sanctions obviously are to cause hardship to a country. The international law position on sanctions is also not very clear in terms of what the limits of it are. There was a group of eminent jurists who gathered at Maastricht last year, issued what they call the Statement of Principles on Extraterritorial Obligation of States. They were speaking about proportionality of the hardship as the determining feature of legality of this. So there are a number of legal issues that surround the question of sanctions. My mandate is to look at what's happening in Iran, regardless of what the causation of that may be. And then finally, the information that is available to me in terms of how that's addressed. Even before sanctions of the current round came into force, if you look at studies of Iran in the provinces, the disparity in the social attainment in the provinces, for example, in Balochistan or in the Khuzestan, compared to the Tehran provinces, you see huge disparities in that. So one should be careful, where one draws a baseline on how things were before a certain date and what's happened since and what is the causation in that. I've spoken to many governments who are what you may call sanctions imposing countries, and I have relayed concerns I've heard from Iranian diaspora to these countries, and I have asked that the exemptions that be made on humanitarian grounds become more effective, or at least they assess more closely how effective these exemptions are, because the reason why they have made these exemptions are because they want this to be effective. And if they are not, as some claim, then obviously there's a reason to revisit how these exemptions work.
Please, Susan Gittleson, and would you, Susan, also identify yourself when the microphone gets there? Thank you.
Susan Gittleson, International Consultants.
Yeah.
Thank you. Since the free press is so important for civil society, would you comment on what is happening to journalists within their prospects of reporting what is actually going on and how the government treats them? Then, since Mr. Hoge mentioned Twitter, what happens to ordinary citizens who want to tell the world what is happening? And then what are the prospects for international journalists to come into Iran, or to, for instance, report some of the things that you've been discussing about sanctions and about what happens to prisoners and so forth?
Thank you. My current report, if you like, the top line concern in that is media freedom and threats to it. Although Turkey now has overtaken Iran in terms of number of journalists in prison, Iran still has a very large number of journalists in prison. 40 plus was a count I had middle of the year. And I've counted a large number of journalists and bloggers having fled the country over the past couple of years, number in several hundreds. So there is, I feel like, a decline in space for media freedom in the country, as you can judge from the harassment of and persecution of journalists and the flight of journalists. At the same time, there have been two new laws passed, one called a cyber crimes law and then a cyber cafe law, both of which are designed to actually, again, curtail the space for media freedom. Both require that users be monitored, or at least the data of users be retained, obviously, for use to determine what use they've been making. And that, again, inhibits free speech. There are reports that people who write about the impact of sanctions get penalized as well, that is, Iranian nationals. So again, that limitation is there. And then we hear of claims of what may be called a halal net, or Iranian domestic internet, as it were, which effectively would have the impact of removing Iran from the World Wide Web, which means people are in a cocoon of the national making. This was one paragraph for which there was no response from the government of Iran, and of course, because there are counterclaims that no such project is being developed. But my top line concern is that there appears to be a targeted persecution of Iranian journalists, bloggers, and others who speak about what's happening in the country. And although there are not frequent reports of international journalists now, at least, being harassed in Iran, I would think it remains a perilous exercise. If you look at families of those working with the BBC Persian and VOA Persian, they have been targeted recently. The idea is to deter their family member working either in the US or in UK, working for BBC Persian or VOA Persian. So I would think one of the foremost concerns about Iran comes from the fact that they are persecuting journalists. And typically, when you do this, then there is a lot more untoward activities in the country that does this sort of activity. And linked to this, of course, is the further concern I have, that they're also targeting what you might call human rights defenders, lawyers, getting sometimes being disbarred for 20 years for perhaps collecting a prize from a foreign country. As I speak, Nasrin Sotoudeh, eminent human rights defender and lawyer, a person who's defended a number of children's cases, lies in very poor health because she's gone on a hunger strike for refusal or for restrictions imposed on her meeting her own family. So really, people who are journalists, people who defend those who fall in trouble, they appear to be two communities currently targeted for persecution.
Ahmed, when you speak about persecution of journalists, bloggers, human rights defenders, is the persecution simply detention, or is it something worse than that? Are these people being tortured or beaten? There
are reports of torture in custody, of variety of sorts. It could be psychological torture, it could be physical torture, and some of the allegations have gone as far as threats and actual incidents of rape. So torture does happen even to journalists, and there have been very, very draconian sentences issued to journalists as well, certainly to bloggers. Often the charge is not to do with the press law. The press law of 1986 does provide journalists open trial. But if they get charged under national security laws, then all these safeguards go out the window. And that's what happens frequently. So yes, you can face very serious charges linked to national security. There can be acts against national security, propaganda, aiding and abetting the enemy, and so on and so forth.
Jeff Laurenti.
Jeff Laurenti with the Century Foundation. Dr. Shaheed, could you tell us to what extent your reports find some echo within some elements of the Iranian political class? That is, you have people in the Majlis, you have people who had been in opposition, run against Ahmadinejad 4 years ago, who presumably have felt themselves some of the sting of the impunity of the security services. To what extent do they pick up your reports? Have you had any evidence that they are citing them? Are they quietly communicating with you? Is there any connection between the work that you're doing and people in Iran citing it as evidence that that our country has to change this lawless security establishment?
Within what I may lose the term, the establishment, I have not received such feedback. But if you look at the way the government is responding, the system is responding to it. The government, the judiciary, members of parliament, the way they are responding to it shows there is no, if you like, coherent response to it, which speaks to, as it were, different views on how to engage with me. It's been parliamentarians who have been the most vociferous, as it were, in their condemnation of me. I do note that the government has not formally rejected either meeting with me or in fact working with me. And that door, in a sense, remains half open, I suppose. In terms of the other elements of the Iranian society, I think the reports are, I should say, read widely, and they do find that it's an important platform for them to air out their grievances or echo their concerns. In fact, many complain to me that concerns of a particular set of people have not been given sufficient priority or sufficient space in the report. So in that sense, that report remains relevant. I might also add that Iran's strategy had been first to sort of ignore me, to say, or to reject my mandate as being illegitimate or illegal. But then their response has been to suggest that they need to respond to my reports. They were there in Geneva in March, and Mr. Jawad Larijani gave a very, if you like, a spirited response to my report, and issued a multiple page, 30-odd pages, was it, Naveed? 30-odd pages response to that report. This time, of course, they have given me a commentary in advance, and on Wednesday, I'm sure they would again speak on a report and its matters. I say this because, unlike, say, a North Korea or even a Myanmar, Iran really cares about what is said about it by the international community. It's currently chairman of the Non-Aligned Movement. Iran contests a number of elections to various UN bodies. So clearly, it needs to seek friends and influence people, influence states at the UN forum. So it doesn't help them to have a lot of criticism from a lot of quarters coming at them. If it was only, I suppose, a few countries sort of criticizing Iran, it would be easy for them to dismiss that as the usual suspects from their perspective. But if you have a large number of countries expressing concern, like last time in the debate in the Human Rights Council, including some from the Caribbean or the Latin American region, and sort of throughout the world, then they feel a lot more pressure to respond. And if you look at some of the penal code changes that's happened over the years, you can track some of this to their own internal dynamic. If you look at Ayatollah Shahrudi and his attempts to sort of end stoning and so on, and you can see some dynamic in that. But you can also see the kinds of external criticisms that were focused on some of the subjects, including the Human Rights Committee dialogue last year, and how some of these things mirror the changes that were made to the penal code. I think there is merit in having this sort of investigation and having more countries than the usual group of countries become aware of these issues, and then a lot of them speak to Iran about the matters of concern to them. So I think plight of journalists is a cross-cutting issue, as it were. It transcends national boundaries. I think the media community throughout the world should be concerned that their fraternity is being undermined in Iran. I think on religious freedom, a number of countries would find it disturbing that there is persecution on religious grounds in any country in the world. So there are issues on which there can be international solidarity, and if that were possible, then I think Iran would feel more pressure or more incentive to address some of these concerns.
Saul.
Thank you. My name is Saul Weisleder. I'm from the mission of Costa Rica to the UN. Thank you very much for a very, very, very detailed and interesting report, and very sincere. My question, it's a bit different. Do you think that there is something in your background that has influenced your writing of the report? I mean, nationality, religion, profession, whatever. Do you think that might have influenced in a way your task. The second question would be, aside from the reaction that the government of Iran or different parts of the government have had about your report, during this period, have you felt any pressure or reaction or anything from the government of Iran, aside from reacting to the report itself?
Thank you very much. I think who I am will always influence what I do. That's a very, very general comment. But there are certain professional standards that one has to bring to bear upon professional work. And you will see the only thing I may have allowed to creep in to my reports is my training as a diplomat in past. Because I do believe there is space for human rights diplomacy, and that I believe that in Iran's case, that is a useful tool, simply because the more countries speak to Iran on this subject, the more they are likely to find a way forward with the issues concerned. So I have, unlike other rapporteurs I have known to have done this work, I make sure that on my visits to Geneva and New York, I meet as a large number of delegations as possible, including delegations whose known position is anti-country mandate holders. And I visit them not because they're going to support my work, but I think it's important for all to know how my mind is evolving on my work and how I'm progressing with the work, so they feel that there's more transparency in the work I do. I think that helps, that has helped me, in fact, in moving forward with my work. And only reason why I do that is because I've been a diplomat by training. Other aspects, no. I don't think my national background, which is the Maldives, only 300,000 people, really matter in this subject. I am a Muslim by background, but my mandate is international human rights law, and you will see that what my methodology is to determine, to judge to what extent Iran complies or does not comply with international human rights law. Now, I may have a different understanding of Iran's context to somebody who is from a different background than I am, but that doesn't directly influence my work. I do understand that Iran frequently cites cultural relativist arguments in defense of the derogations. My view is that human rights are universal, and that A, under international law, you cannot cite national customs as a reason to not perform your obligation under international law, and B, I also believe that no matter whichever script you're looking at, there could be difficulties, but all of these can be resolved if you have a progressive enough reading of the texts. And I'm aware there are a number of scholars, both in Iran and from other Muslim communities, who believe that international human rights law is compatible with Islamic practices. So in my reporting, I have been very careful to ensure that what I'm measuring here is international human rights law and Iran's performance with it in a very objective manner. I hope that's the response for the first question. The second question, the answer is no. All the engagement with Iran has been, as it were, on the table.
Adam?
Hi, Adam Lupel from IPI. You know that discussions in New York about Iran are very much focused on non-proliferation. And I'm wondering if you see your work as complementary to that, at times perhaps in tension, or just completely separate. And if you see it as completely separate, does that present a challenge sometimes?
I think human rights concerns are freestanding concerns. They are independent of any other. In my judgment, overrides other concerns as well. If at all anything, I am concerned about the ever-increasing noise about the nuclear issue. it can drown out concerns about human rights issues. And that's the concern I have. I don't think human rights issues are linked to any national security or international security issues. Without respect for human rights, we've seen time and time again that conflicts emerge, that there is no peace. Either there'll be no peace either for the Iranian people themselves, unless there was sufficient safeguard of human rights, nor will the region feel sufficiently safe if there was a human rights crisis in their midst. So the answer is no, the two are not linked. And if anything, I am concerned that people give more priority perhaps to nuclear issue than to listen to human rights debates.
I wanted to ask you a question about UN procedure and what will happen to your report. Wednesday, I think it's actually at 4 o'clock on Wednesday, you will present the report to the third committee. Is that done in an open forum? Do you get responses from them there? Do they ultimately respond to it? Does it ever become before the General Assembly itself? I guess what I'm asking is, what, in the end, what happens to your report? Is the UN able to use your report and achieve something, or is it another one of those documents that just gets lost in the UN bureaucracy?
Well, I have a lot of faith in the United Nations system to begin with, than the last comment would warrant. What happens is there'll be 30 minutes of debate. I get 7 minutes to present my report. I think the right of reply goes to the delegation of Iran, 5 minutes to respond to the initial statement. And there'll be a floor will be open for all member states to comment until 30 minutes are up. Each may get no more than, I think, 2-3 minutes to speak. At the end of it, Iran might get last comment on that, but then I will respond to any queries and comments that may have been raised in the debate, and that's it for that session. And then typically in New York, there have been a resolution on human rights situation in Iran that often draws on the reports of both the rapporteur and the Secretary General. And in last year, certainly, there were a number of provisions in that which were linked to the report I presented. And I hope there'll be a lot more links between the report I present and the resolution, which I hope will again call for a moratorium on executions, release of political detainees, steps to ensure a free and fair election for the presidency next year, and a number of other issues about judiciary, women's status, and discrimination in the country. So I hope all that will be there. And last year, for the first time, the number of delegations supporting that resolution reached high 80s, which is the kind of respectable level at the UN for a resolution on human rights, on a country's human rights record. In Iran, it used to be, I think, mid to high 60s in the past. So if that number remains at that level or keeps rising, then I think the statement of human rights concern certainly is made very, very clearly. And I think with that kind of support for the resolution, I would think Iran would look at some of its own practices.
And in March, when you do that report for the Human Rights Council in Geneva, is it the same procedure? Or frankly, is this more important here at headquarters?
It's more difficult to answer a question of relative importance, but certainly in...
is the impact greater?
Impact is greater perhaps in New York because the resolution will have a wider number of countries supporting it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Maureen?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Maureen Quinn, International Peace Institute. You've talked about some of the human rights around the issues of the press, journalists, religious. What about women's rights? What are you saying in your report this time? Thank you.
Thank you. All my reports have spoken, have written about my concerns about women's status in Iran, which for me is quite serious. There are widespread violations of women's rights. Women are almost seen as second-class citizens in Iran. And That's one area where I make an exception when I say Iran has a basic legal framework, because in women's case, it doesn't have the framework to uphold women's rights. There's discrimination in law and in practice in relation to marriage and divorce, inheritance, compensation for loss, and so on and so forth. I'm also concerned about reports of young girls being married. Well, the age of marriage in Iran under law is 13 years for girls and 15 years for boys. That's itself very low, but the law does provide for a father or grandfather to write to the court to get permission to marry girls of even at an age less than that. So there have been reports of hundreds of girls being married off at ages below 13 over the past few years, and that's a matter I refer in my report. And there are a number of other legal provisions in the country's framework that discriminate against women. My next report, which should be compiled before the end of the year and should go to the Council by March, I intend to focus a lot on women's status, as well as children. Now, recently, there have been a ban on access to universities for women. A number of faculties have banned outright taking on women students in the universities. This comes after a number of years of concern over a quota that was imposed on women students. Now, mind you, women's education in Iran has been something they've been quite happy to sort of talk about, comparing quite well with a number of its neighbors. But these two trends, and in the last one, the outright ban, is a matter of serious concern. And if you look at already the workforce participation rate, women is about 15%, and men are about 65%. That's a very huge disparity as well. And for me, it appears that the central place given to family in Iranian government's development plans imposes a disproportionate burden on women, as if they have to carry the burden of family, and therefore their place is home, as people who take a family. That's a concern to me. But of course, they make a number of other provisions to look into women's welfare. A number of things have been made in law and practice, but they do not still give equality or even contemplate giving equality to women as men in a legal sense, as required by the ICCPR or by the CEDAW. And I am also concerned that one of the recommendations Iran rejected at the UPR process, and one of the treaties Iran has so far not signed, is the Convention on Women's Rights, CEDAW. And I would hope that Iran would consider signing on to that convention.
I know when you listed the persecuted religions, you didn't mean for it to be a full list, but I wanted to ask you about one group, and that's Iranian Jews.
I have not been able to document specific violations of their rights, but the general picture I have gathered is that of course, they are a recognized religion, and I think they also have a representation in parliament because of that. But the number of the Jewish community in Iran has eroded or has declined significantly over the years. I haven't got any specific data on that, but they also fall under general practices of discrimination, but they have not met the kinds of situations I have come across from other communities, perhaps because I have not been accessible to them enough for me to get the information from them.
Excellent. Well, if I see, oh, very good, front row, an Iranian.
Good afternoon. Dr. Surush Roshan, Iranian, but I have not lived in Iran for many years, so my information could not be very accurate. My first question is, how did you select Iran for investigation of the human rights? My second question and comment is, the impact of sanction has been very severe, especially in the medical field. Medicine was extremely expensive before, and now it has been practically impossible for people to obtain it in the black market. I think that is an issue of human rights. Nutrition and food prices has become very difficult for lower socioeconomic class in Iran. So I would like to see a little balance about especially medicine and food for people in your report. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. Your first part of the question, why is Iran being investigated? This partly linked to the developments in Iran, especially since the 2009 elections and the violence that followed, when there were, by some reports, hundreds of people who were being killed, and the whole suppression of that people's movement thereafter was quite visible in terms of the TV coverage, the reports that came out. It happened in front of the world audience. It was quite horrifying to many. And then, of course, there was a spike. There's been a steady spike in executions. Again, I speak only with the knowledge I have, so there could be numbers that were never known, but I think 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the number would have been below 100 or around 100, but the number had gone up to, steadily increased up to almost 700 last year. And these are all documented executions. I have not included in this executions for which I was not able to verify the reports of. So that's one element. The other was the fact that Iran was not cooperating with the international community on what's happening in the country. Now, for example, not since 2005 has anyone been allowed to go into Iran to investigate what's happening there. The last two rapporteurs to go in that year were the rapporteur on violence against women and the rapporteur on adequate housing. And the reports they produced were quite disturbing as well in terms of the subjects that they had covered. And then Iran at the time not, for a long time, Iran remains one of the highest non-responder, as it were, to communications from the Human Rights Office in Geneva. So if you add the domestic violation of human rights, the closure of cooperation with the UN offices, obviously, the concerns increase. And per capita wise, Iran is the highest, has the highest figures for death penalty. One of the few countries who until recently would send teenagers to prison, to the gallows. One of the few countries where you would have as high as 40 plus journalists in prison. One of the few countries where you would have a systematic rejection of international human rights law. So from all these counts and more, it was the judgment of the Human Rights Council that the report on Iran needs to be reassigned. There was a rapporteur to Iran before as well, and his mandate was wound down by and large because in 2002, Iran said it'll open up the doors for all the rapporteurs. So it gave what was called a standing invitation to all rapporteurs to visit. If that kind of openness is there, then people know what's going on, they engage with the country, and then can address issues and move forward. But when you shut the door and you don't respond to communications, something like, I think, 500 communications in one, I think, or a 3-year period were not responded to. That creates a concern. So if the Human Rights Council has to maintain credibility on being able to monitor country situations, then Iran comes one of the foremost cases. And you would notice it's not only Iran who has rapporteurs assigned to it. Iran claims, why isn't the US being investigated? US is one of the highest, has the highest number of rapporteur visits for any country. You have, Iran says, why isn't there a rapporteur to Israel? But there is one, it just carries a different name. Mr. Falk is a rapporteur for the occupied territories. There is a rapporteur for North Korea, a rapporteur to a number of countries in which there are issues about human rights of a very serious nature do get country mandate holders to examine them. Yes, on the question of medicines, nutrition, these are the earliest, if you like, signs of sanctions biting into the human rights aspects of people, the initial signs of a humanitarian issue coming up. And I am very keen to be able to study this in a structured manner to understand how much the medical supplies are being affected, what kinds of things are being affected, and why the exemptions on these are not being effective, because they're not targeted directly. They're not part of any sanctions in themselves. So why are they not working? The exemptions be made for this, and what internal space does Iran have to respond to these situations? What allocations has Iran made to respond to these, if you like, the negative effects on its social security system? So a lot has to be. How has the real devaluation affected the national expenditure? Do we see a rise across the board reduction in buying capacity, or are some sectors still continuing with high expenditures while others are being neglected? So a lot of this has to be studied before I can say authoritatively that you ought to do A, B, C, and D on this subject. So they have not been ignored. They will form part of my concern. I am having this under review, but I would very much like Iran to cooperate with me in giving more access to relevant data on this subject.
I would like to finish with a statement of apologies and thanks. The apology is that we originally scheduled this for Friday. Not a very smart thing for us to have done, because Friday is Eid al-Adha. And we should have realized that before. When we realized it, we quickly prevailed upon Dr. Shaheed to change. He was very willing to do so. So my apologies and thanks to him, and also apologies and thanks to you. Thanks to you for living with this sudden change in timing and showing up in such hearty numbers and participating so actively in this conversation. Dr. Shaheed, thank you very, very much for the candor of what you told us. It's extremely interesting, and I think we all wish you well in your endeavor as the rapporteur. Thank you.